I'm delighted to be here for this occasion in your lovely apartment, Robert and Lucy. And we're so grateful that you finished our piece. And I'd like to start off by asking you how you came to choose this particular fable, Katchi-Katchi, for our trio.
Well, first of all, you have to know that you have been asking me for so long that the guilt that's been built up inside me is literally almost overwhelming. So I was ready to compose anything for you, but I didn't want to compose something that wasn't good. And, you know, as you grow older, you become more selective about what you want to compose. And all of a sudden it was almost like one of these kind of dreamlike inspirations. I woke up one day and said, you know, one of the narrative pieces that I've done for the Japanese audiences was a folk tale for narrator, violin, and piano. And the narration point seemed to me literally a perfect kind of clarinet part. I said, absolutely, this is a possibility I must explore. So what I did was that I looked through the piece very carefully, and I saw that I could, almost like Schoenberg did with his fantasy, you know, he wrote the violin part first, and then he wrote the piano part. So I saw that the narrator was asking for a part that could be the clarinet. So I said, that's the piece for Walter and Elsa. So I did exactly that. I began to compose it. I didn't know how it would turn out. And when I really began to see the possibilities, I said, this is perfect. I almost prefer it to the narrative part. So I really finished it, and now it's in your hands.
Well, and now Elsa is my competitor.
That's right.
There I am.
She's the narrator
well,
now.
She has no ambitions.
No, she's a great narrator, but she narrates on her clarinet.
On the clarinet. And we're so lucky to have captured you narrating the story also. And Another thing I wanted to ask is, of course, you want to work together, so that's probably how you started to write narrative pieces for Lucy.
This has been going on
right?
for years.
Well, actually, I had always been intrigued, even as a teenager, with narrative and music. And I had written any number of musical compositions to poetic narrations. You know, it's a long, you know, the melodrama, it has a long history, started by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and going through Benda, and Mozart even wrote a melodrama, and Strauss wrote Ina Garden, and so on. So I had done something like this, but when I met Lucy, my wife, she wasn't my wife in the early days, and she was a terrific theater person. So she had studied with Schneider and Walter Kerr, and we had decided for some children of our friends to do a combination. And I wrote some things for Rudyard Kipling and Hans Christian Andersen, and we just did it for fun, you see, narrator and piano and violin. And my friend Isaac Stern heard them and saw the score, and he said, "You have to do more of these. These are fantastic." So I began to write them. I'd written a story called The Terrible Tempered Conductor, which he did with orchestras, and in any number of orchestras, for narrator and orchestra. But basically, I've done about 35 of these works, and I've done a lot of chamber music too. So it was just natural to convert her narrative into a clarinet part for Elsa. And basically, I'm hoping it works very well.
Yes.
Long ago, there lived an old man and his wife. One day, he went to plant beans, and he sang, "One bean shall grow 1,000. A badger jeered back, "His beans shall rot." The old man knocked the badger out and carried him home. "Grandmother," he said, "cook badger soup." Then he went to town, and the badger woke and pleaded, "Untie me, and I'll help you." "No," shrieked the woman. The badger pleaded again, and finally the woman untied him. Whereupon the badger beat the old woman to death, put on her clothes, and cooked grandmother's soup. When the old man returned, the badger, in grandmother's clothes, shouted, "Eat your soup." The old man said, "This soup smells like grandmother." The badger replied, "It is normal that an old badger smells like a grandmother." When the old man finished the soup, the badger shouted, "Indeed, you ate grandmother's soup," and then escaped into the mountains. The old man cried and cried, and a hare passed by and asked, "Why are you crying?" The old man told the hare, and the hare said, "I will avenge you." The hare climbed a reed mountain and cut reeds, and the badger came by and asked, "Why are you cutting reeds?" The hare replied, "Winter is coming, and I must thatch my roof." "What a good idea," said the badger. "Let's cut reeds together." Later, as they walk along, the hare knocked the flints together behind the badger's back that sounded like Katchi-Katchi. "What is this Katchi-Katchi?" asked the badger. The hare answered, "This is Katchi-Katchi Mountain, and the Katchi-Katchi bird is singing." The reeds on the badger's back began to burn, and the flames burned the badger's back. "Itai, Itai!" yelled the badger, throwing down the reeds and escaping into the mountains. Days later, the hare climbed Pepper Mountain to gather peppers, and the badger saw the hare and complained, "You have burned my back." And the hare answered, "There are many hares. You must complain to the Reed Mountain hare. I am the hare of the Pepper Mountain. I see, said the badger. So, hare of Pepper Mountain, what are you doing? The hare said, my people suffer from burns, and I am making an ointment for the burns. What a coincidence, said the badger. Please put your ointment on my back. The hare squeezed the hot peppers and rubbed them over the badger's back. Eat-tie, eat-tie, shrieked the badger, and escaped with great difficulty into the mountains. A few days passed, and the hare climbed Pound Mountain. Again the badger approached him and shouted, Hey, you rub burning ointment on my back. But the hare said, You are confused. That was the hare of the Pepper Mountain. I am the hare of the Pine Mountain. I see, said the badger. Why do you cut these pines? So I can build a boat to catch a sardine, said the hare. Ah, said the badger, would you please build me a boat too? Come back tomorrow, said the hare. The next day, the badger returned. Have you made my boat, he asked. Yes, said the hare. Mine is made of wood, and yours of solid earth. Then the hare and the badger came to the water and rowed out to sea. Hare sang, Wooden boat, concorashado, earthen boat, zacaruasho, and then hit the boat hard with his oar. The badger then did the same, over and over. They kept singing and hitting. Wooden boat, bankarako, earthen boat, zacaroshko. And as they continued, the badger's earthen boat dissolved and sank with the badger. Dondu harai.
Yes, well, we're convinced it works very well. And actually, our session with you helped a lot today. That really helped.
Well, always helps to
clarify
play
it.
for the composer, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
I found that true, too.
Now, I wanted to ask you something about your compositional background. Did you ever actually formally study composition?
Yes, of course. I always composed. When I was 13, I composed my first composition. That's next to Mozart. That's very late. But basically, I even composed the music for our senior play in high school. You know, Death Takes a Holiday. I wrote the music. When I came to Juilliard, I studied with Bernard Wagner composition, but I also met Stefan Volpe, and I studied with him for about 3 years. I always brought my compositions to him, and he always gave me lessons. And then, of course, I was on my own. In the Army during the war years, I composed. And when I got out of the Army, as a matter of fact, when I won the Naumburg, the requirement was always, and is today, that you must play on your debut recital an American composed piece. So I wrote my own. I didn't want to play somebody else.
You wrote your own?
Yes, and I've actually looked at it. It's not a bad piece. But basically, I've done all this. Now, I wrote for everything. I wrote for chorus, for voice, for orchestra, for chamber music, and I wrote a piece called, I told you, The Terrible Tempered Conductor, with narrator for Lucy when I met her. And we were great friends with Dimitri Mitropoulos. And I had a chance to show him the score. And he looked at it and he said, "You know, Robert, I like the music, but I don't like your story. It's about a conductor and it's not a nice story." So I thought, well, all right. But he said, "But I like the music. Compose me a piece." Now, he was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic.
Yes, I remember.
And I thought he was just being nice. So about a month later, I meet him. He used to be around, he lived in a hotel on 57th Street. And I ran into him down there in that area, and he said, "How's my piece coming?" And I was absolutely astonished. He really was serious. So I rushed home and I began composing a piece. It turned out to be something called A Fantasy for Orchestra. Well, it was an interesting story. I brought it to him at an intermission of a New York Philharmonic concert, and he spent the whole 15 minutes looking at my piece on the score. And he said, "It's wonderful. Absolutely, I like it. But, you know, it ends softly." And he said, "Think about it. How many pieces in history end softly and are a success?" So, you know, the Farewell Symphony of Haydn, the Pathétique Symphony of Tchaikovsky. But can't you see that you could bring back some of the exciting things at the end and end more positively? So I thought at first when I went home, I can't do that. That's a compromise. I can't do that. But then I thought, you damn fool, how many people get a chance to have a piece played by the New York Philharmonic? So I did actually bring and finished it with a splurge of excitement, okay? We're at the rehearsal with the New York Philharmonic listening, and I'm sitting next to Pierre Boulez and Elliott Carter, who was a friend of mine. And they liked the piece. I was absolutely thrilled. They really liked the piece, and these were two bona fide great composers. But Elliott turns to me and said, "Bobby, it sounds to me like that end is tucked on as if it's artificial." And he was right, of course. Anyway.
I think we should tell Walter about our first date at Stefan Volpe's.
Oh, that would be very interesting indeed.
Well, you know, Lucy was not a trained musician. She never studied music.
Lucy was not a musician at all.
Well, I'm saying
Not trained, not
right. But she came to Juilliard and applied to run the position of concert manager of the concerts at Juilliard. And she got the job. Okay. I was studying with Volpe on the outside, and she was a gorgeous-looking girl in the concert office. And finally, I got up my courage and said, "Would you come on a date with me?" So she said, "Yes." So what did I do? Well, I wasn't very bright. So the date I took her on was an evening at Stefan Volpe's house where people were playing Stefan Volpe's compositions
And there was this one piece called Battle Pieces,
for piano.
which was absolutely, I don't know how to describe it without, I don't want to insult it, but for me it was absolutely a classical.
For a non-musician.
And after it was all over, it was a very long piece, it was about 20 minutes. And after it was all over, I started up to get my hat and coat, and Irma Jurist, who was at that point somebody in the audience, called, "Oh, play it again, please." And so I decided that I would never have another date with Robert.
And that was in 1947, and this is now 2002.
Well, that's just a funny little story.
Now, did you actually leave and walk out? Or?
I left in, no, I stayed for
Oh,
the
you
second.
stayed
For the second performance.
Second performance.
But,
But you didn't
I
like it
couldn't
any
get
better.
out.
Oh, she hated it.
Get out. I hated it. I hated him. I hated the whole occasion. And I decided that that had been the wrong thing for me. Yes.
So how did
But
you
he
get
was
back together again? I
don't know,
have
he
to
was
ask
quite
now.
persistent. And Leonid Hamburg was helpful. Well, that doesn't have much to do with this situation.
Well, but
since he said he
really
studied with
interesting.
Volpa, I thought, we should mention
Absolutely.
how connected.
Absolutely.
But there was a kind of festival of Volpa because it's his 100th anniversary of his birth right now. And I saw that his battle pieces were being played in New York right now.
Are you going to go hear them?
It's probably a magnificent piece. Did you like it?
Lucy, I love Volpa's compositions. You have to know that.
Yeah. Well, you were speaking about being influenced by Metropolis about your piece, which brings me to a question, because sometimes we feel like we get so many new pieces, and we'd like to make a suggestion to a composer. I mean, if we feel either the ending isn't strong, or it's too short, or it's too long. Sometimes because it's too long. How do you feel about that? You commissioned so many works with the Juilliard Quartet. How do you deal with that when you feel that the piece needs something, but one is naturally reticent to say anything to the composer? He might be insulted. Yeah. On the other hand, some composers are happy if you give them some feedback.
Well, Walter, you know that the history of composition is not a kind of fixed fact. In other words, people, great composers even, write music, and then years later they revise it. Brahms is famous for revising his earlier composition. So on. We know very much for a fact that Schubert wrote his E-flat trio with a lot more in the last movement, and then finally crossed it out, and most people play the shortened version today. I've seen manuscripts of Beethoven where he crossed out things. Even Mozart in the D major quintet, there's a whole written new last movement. In other words, people are constantly changing their composition. It's wrong to think that pieces come inspired by God and that's it, Now, on that basis, people change. For instance, as a performer, you try to play a piece according to the way you think the composer likes it. Now, I can tell you the most startling experience the Juilliard Quartet ever had in terms of meeting up with a new composition, feeling one way and then changing.
Could I ask one question?
Sure.
The answer I'd like to have is, did the Juilliard Quartet ever interfere with any composition you've done? In a sense, did you ever tell the composer, please do this or do that, in answer to that question? I don't think you have.
I don't think
complained a lot, but you
we
never-
ever changed a composition. I can tell you a funny story, which I don't think Virgil Thompson would mind.
He's dead.
We had to play and record a quartet of Virgil Thompson. And when we played it, we were at the studio ready for the recording when we played it for him for the first time. And he was very unhappy with how we played it. Really. a lot more unhappy, than you could imagine. I mean, he just didn't like how we played it. So our cellist, who was very clever and very devious, said to Virgil Thompson, look, this is a recording studio, and we're about to make a record. Why don't you conduct us? Nobody will see the conducting on the recording. Conduct us, and you will have, pretty much, we'll follow you what you want. So we did that. And afterwards, he used to say, it's the best recording of a modern composition I ever heard. That's Virgil Thompson.
In answer to the question, did you ever
change anything?
or
No.
ask a composer to change it?
Did you make any suggestions?
Never. No, we always respected the composer. If we didn't like the piece eventually, we didn't play it. Now, I just want to tell one other story because it's very important to this point. We were called up by the Russian publishers in Soviet Russia and asked if we would like to play Shostakovich's last quartet as the American premiere. And we were sort of flattered. We hadn't played a lot of Shostakovich. We played about 5 or 6 with his quartet. And we said yes. So then we got the music from them, and we started practicing it. And I don't know if you know the piece, Walter, but it's a series of slow movements, finally culminating in a faster movement at the end. But basically, it sounded to me like a Russian Orthodox service, going on for hours and hours of slow music. And we weren't contemptuous or superior, but we were upset. And we even considered calling up the Russians and say we didn't want to do it. Well, but then we decided we couldn't do that. That was not diplomatic. So we started in earnest practicing the piece. Now, I think we practiced it for about 3 weeks before the performance, every day. And I have to tell you that without knowing it, we made a transition from not liking the piece and not wanting to play it to not being able to play it without tears rolling down our cheeks because we were so affected by it. Now that gives you an idea how, we're not naive musicians. We're pretty sophisticated. And really we could go through such a transition. So it makes you a little bit humble in face of new music.
That's true. And we have had somewhat similar experiences with the von Einem piece. I always liked it from the beginning, but it's very, it kind of seems like a crazy piece made out of all sorts of tonal references to Brahms and Bach and people like that. And then after a while, but we played it a long time, maybe
Any number of
a year,
performances?
maybe a number of
And
performances.
that's why we just love it. I love to play that.
Yes, and now it's really a meaningful, beautiful.
Isn't that strange?
Yeah.
How we make that
I
transition?
think maybe in playwriting, for example, that playwrights are very into listening to the production when it goes into rehearsal, and will take suggestions very often about
Yes.
how actors feel about what they're saying.
Sometimes they change a whole act,
Which
because
is much more so than composers, I would think.
well, don't
Well,
be
with
too sure.
composers, it is a sensitive subject. I mean, I know
I
that.
understand, right.
There
Right,
was-
absolutely.
But and understandably so.
Yeah, how would you feel if somebody asked you to change something in your work?
Well, I told you
He
already.
did.
Yes, well, yes, but suppose they told you to change something quite substantial.
Well, if it changed the whole idea of the piece, I'd say either no or I'd give up the piece, I mean, one has to have a certain integrity with one's creative process. I mean, you can't just because somebody doesn't like it, change it. You don't do that. But basically, if it's a very, you might say, on criticism that means something to you, then you think seriously about it and do something
Does
different.
it matter who gives the criticism?
Certainly.
Well-
It doesn't have to be famous. It has to be somebody who really understands.
It doesn't even have to be the performer. It could be someone from the listening audience.
No, but basically you put your finger on something. Generally, it is performers who do get composers, bad and great, to change. In other words, Joachim certainly had an influence on Brahms's writing, and Ferdinand David had a great influence on Mendelssohn's writing. And so we know that various performers did affect the way composers compose.
Yes, and it was interesting that Brahms always gave his scores to Clara Schumann and,
Right.
and to his friend Billroth, you know, the surgeon.
Right. Do I know?
And
I had the Billroth 2 operation, so I know that.
really?
Yes, the stomach operation.
Oh, no
He
kidding.
invented it.
Oh, no kidding.
He was also
Did
an
they play Brahms
anti-Semite,
when
too.
you had it?
What?
Did they play Brahms while you had it?
No, I don't remember that.
But so somehow he must have trusted his judgment enough to, I mean, to,
No.
for a man like Brahms, who was he was not known for his humility or
No, he knew what he wanted.
he knew what he wanted.
But he was also very self-critical.
Yeah.
But what do you do when, in my case, for example, if somebody is listening to my narration and somebody likes it, it's a person who doesn't like a certain kind of acting or a certain kind of narration,
Yeah.
or it's a person who loves, great and the acting and movement and everything. And sometimes you're faced with the opposite kind of thing.
Such as with Dudley and with Yenu. I mean, they were opposites in terms of narration.
I mean, how they liked.
How they liked it. So
Yeah.
I guess.
When
it's
she
just-
mentions Dudley, she's talking about Dudley
Dudley
Moore, who's a
Moore.
very
Moore,
close friend.
He disliked anything that's
Was too
smelled of acting.
over dramatic.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
he
don't
liked
know what
understatement.
He did with Olivier
Yeah.
and those people, but he really hated any kind of overacting.
But
And
our friend
Eugene
Eugene
Lehner.
Lehner, who was a great musician, loved melodramatic
Yeah.
dramatic.
He loved it. Just ate it up.
Well, I mean, people are different. All the performers are different too.
You know,
I
some
mean,
people love Tchaikovsky and some people hate it.
Yeah, that's right. Or the way we play, some people. like it.
Exactly. I mean, there's the idea of subjective aesthetic, preference is. I mean, it's open to the.
But people who hate Tchaikovsky later on like him better. don't
Oh, we all go through stages where we like a composer and don't like them and like them again. I mean, it happens all the time.
It makes it interesting. Do you have some thoughts about where music is heading? Since there are so many different streams of composition going on, and you've certainly commissioned so many works too.
It's a difficult question, Walter. Really difficult, because nobody can put their finger on where music is going. There was a time when everybody thought it was headed towards the electronic world completely. Yes. And there were electronic laboratories. John Cage even had, in University of Illinois, a computer composing, working. The computer's name was Iliac, I even remember that. And he had it compose music, you see. And that fell by the wayside. Today, you don't even begin to have much electronically infused music. You have mixes a little bit.
Minimalist.
But all right, then there was a period, you're right, Lucy, when
Minimalism.
minimalism was in.
Yes.
And everybody thought it was headed that way with Philip Glass and John Adam and everything. And it sort of did make headway, but then it sort of got established, and then it just became one of the avenues of how music is.
Crossover.
Yes, now you have people playing jazz stuff with classical stuff, and Yo-Yo Ma's running over the Silk Road. I mean, all by himself and with a bunch of ethnic musicologists, and bringing back compositions from Mongolia and from Turkestan and so on, and it'll have its play, and it'll then sort of sink into the fabric of the whole time. And so to say, where is music headed? The only way I'd like to answer it is that I don't think that any music can be composed at any time that doesn't engage the most creative mind issues and the most creative feelingful heart issues together. I mean, that's what, I don't care what the fashion is for a particular age, that is what makes things last in human circumstance.
So more than certain techniques, like even tonality
Well, that
or
can be
12 tone.
interesting for a moment,
Yes,
you see,
yes.
but it doesn't mean that's the end of creation.
Well, then I have a question. What about concert artists and audiences these days? I mean, the
That's
audiences
another hard question.
are falling off. What do we do about that?
All right, well, I have two thoughts. I mean, I'm not I can't answer it too well, but because no one really knows. But basically, first of all, I have one advantage to most classically trained musicians. I don't know where I fell in love with the music all over the world. In other words, many people will hear Japanese or Indonesian, Balinese or Javanese music and turn up their noses because they've been raised in Western classic tradition, and also, if they're younger, rock and popular music according to the way we listen to music, right?
Yeah.
But I've always been very moved by music that sounds exotic, strange. I listened in Korea to 300- and 400-year-old court music where they used to break the vocal boxes of the women singers to get a certain peculiar sound, and I loved it. In other words, I never had any trouble with listening to music that didn't have relationship to my music.
What about audiences?
So, now wait a minute. That's leading to what I'm saying, that today, for instance, even in America, we were European-oriented because, first of all, we ignored the Native American arts, and all the European people who settled in our country were oriented to the music of Central Europe and France, and the Moravians were listening to music from Bohemia, and Thomas Jefferson was playing the violin and had a harpsichord, and so on. But basically today, if you think about it, an enormous growing of Hispanic people, and they're not interested in Beethoven and Bach. They're interested in tangos and South American music and Caribbean music.
That's right.
And so all of the music is absorbing around itself so that it creates a new phenomena of culture, which is a different move. And we will end up in the future playing different music, still liking the old music, but it'll take its place along with new music.
Well, what about a place like the Miller Theatre, where they say there are lots of young people coming to the contemporary music concerts, more than ever before?
Well,
So that's a kind of interesting thing.
yes,
I think it also
young
has-
people are always interested in new things. We have to know that.
And I think the halls have also something to do with it. For instance, this new piano series, which is being done at churches and ethical culture auditorium, somehow or other the younger people are interested in going to different places
Rather than
Alice Tully Hall.
Yes.
Carnegie.
You
Yeah.
know, it's so conventional,
Yes.
it's so sort of stiff.
People try everything, Lucy.
People try.
For instance, you have rug concerts,
Yes.
and in
Well,
Europe,
the young people like that.
yes, and people will try everything. I think the day of coming to a concert in a formal dress is over.
Yes.
I don't think that's going to occur anymore.
Let me ask you about your experiences with some composers. Now, you worked very closely with Elliott Carter. How many of the quartets did you actually commission?
Well,
Commission.
first of all, the first quartet was written at the time of the Walden String Quartet, which was in residence at the University of Illinois. And I heard it. I thought it was wonderful. The second quartet was written for us. The third quartet was commissioned by a quartet from your state, from Michigan, University of Michigan,
Really?
the Stanley Quartet.
Oh, yes.
And they didn't play it. They kept putting it off. We don't know why they didn't play it. Maybe it was too difficult. Who knows?
Do you still have a Stanley quartet?
No. It doesn't exist
It's
for years.
not our university. That's
Right,
University of
right.
Michigan.
Anyway, finally, we said to Elliott, they're not playing it. It was written for them. Couldn't we play it? And he said, certainly. I'll ask them. And they said, oh, yes, let them play it. So we played it. And we gave that commission. The fourth quartet was written for the Composers Quartet.
I see.
But we did play it. The fifth quartet was written for the Arditi Quartet. And I never played it with the Juilliard. But a year and a half ago, I gave an all-Carter concert, in which I did the duo and a piece he wrote for me for my birthday and a number of things. And basically, at that time, I got a quartet together with Nicholas, my son,
Yes.
and a couple of other people, and we played the fifth quartet. So I've played all the quartets.
And now I know Babbitt has written for the
Yes, he
Juilliard.
wrote, for our 50th anniversary, he wrote a clarinet quintet, which we loved. Actually, Charlie Neidig played it with the Juilliard String Quartet. And we've also played 3 of his, by now I think he's written 5 quartets.
And can you mention some of the other composers whose works you premiered that you feel are major
Walter, there's
people
so
that
many.
you? I'm sure, but some of the major contributions maybe to the.
Well, you mean
String
that they
quartet
composed?
literature. Yeah, that they
The
composed.
point is that we never knew Bartók,
Yes.
but we were probably the first quartet, certainly in America, that played all 6 Bartók quartets.
Right.
Do you know, when I was at Oberlin, you came.
Yes, we played them there.
I know.
I remember.
That was such a formative thing for me. I'll
Really?
never forget that. I meant to tell you that years after when I met you. But anyway, go ahead.
Do you want to know what I remember a lot there is that they had an old-fashioned heating situation, and the
Made noise.
radiators were making noise. Do you remember that? That's
Absolutely, they
true.
did.
Yes. Well, we played Bartók. I mean, when I was 14, I fell in love with Bartók music. We had a wonderful music library in Portland, Oregon, and they had everything of contemporary music. I don't know why or how, but it did happen, and I loved
Well,
Bartók.
how about David Diamond? Did you ever, he didn't commission anything for you, did he?
We were never commissioned by him, but we played at least 6 of his string quartets. You know, he's written a lot of them.
Yes.
He's written maybe 13 or 14.
Well,
I don't know.
and didn't you premiere a quartet concerto with the? Wasn't that written
Yes,
for the
David.
Juilliard?
Actually, you're right. David Diamond
I
wrote
remember,
us a concerto for string quartet that we gave the premiere with the Minnesota Symphony.
Oh yes.
My gosh,
There have been
I
so
can't
many.
remember. We must have played at least 200 premieres of works. Not all written for us, but many of them written for us. Yeah.
Did you do Laird?
Like you, by the way.
Lairdahl?
Yes, Fred Lairdahl was commissioned, and he wrote a quartet for us, and we even recorded it. It's commercially recorded. Yeah.
Actually, I love the story you just told us earlier about the Schoenberg quartet. Could you tell that story real quick?
Oh, that's right. When you played
For him?
For him, yes. Now, when would that have been? In
I
48,
remember.
49?
Well, it's before he died, obviously.
Yeah. When did he die? In 52?
No, I think he died around 1950. What happened, actually, the story builds up earlier. I was, of course, starting with the Juilliard Quartet. We formed it in 46. But I was also, of course, a committed camper and hiker. And my favorite place in the whole world in those days, and maybe still is Glacier National Park. I used to go there all the time. And I'd fallen in love with Eugene Lehner, who had been, in the Kolisch Quartet, and knew Bartók and Schoenberg and all these people. And he gave me an introduction to Schoenberg. And at that time, I wanted to see Schoenberg as a composer, not as a performer. And I remember I took a train out to Glacier Park, stacked my compositions and everything of that nature in a locker, and went off for a week and a half hiking and camping in the Glacier National Park. Then I came back, and I got to a plane in Kalispell, I think, Montana, flew to Reno, Nevada, then flew from Reno to Los Angeles, and called up Arnold Schoenberg and asked if I could come and visit him. He had been already warned by my friend, Eugene Lehner, that I would bother him. So he said, all right, come. So I came to his Westwood apartment, and he said, young man, you asked to see me? And so I said, yes, I need some advice, Mr. Schoenberg. I've composed since I was 13, and I'd like you to tell me, should I continue composing? So I showed him, I had a whole handful of compositions, manuscripts, and he took about 15 minutes leafing through them. I don't know what he saw, what he felt. When he finished, he turned to me and he said, "Young man," he said, "you want to be a composer?" He said, "Then I make you an advice. You, every day in your life, whether you're sick or well, whether you have an idea or you have no idea, whether it's inspired or it's mediocre, you write at least 50 bars of music. Just, it doesn't matter whether you like it or don't like it or have a thought that it's worth composing or not." He said, "If you do that, eventually you will be a composer."
A composer.
Yes, yes,
Did
a
you
composer.
take that? Were you disappointed?
No.
And he didn't say, "Oh, you're wonderful"?
No. I wasn't looking for vast praise. Come on, listen. I just wanted to tell me whether I should continue or not. And he said, "You continue if you want to."
And then, so how did it come that you that you
then
performed
he
for
knew
him?
me a little bit, but we still had intercessions from people like Edward Steuermann and Lehner, that this is a young quartet that's playing all your string quartets. So he was interested, and we then said, could we come out to Los Angeles and play for you? So he said, okay. So that's how we ended up going to his place.
David Diamond was there, wasn't he?
Yes. And weren't you there, Lucy?
Yeah,
No.
I was there. I
Yes.
remember his daughter with a jug of wine.
Yes,
on her
Nuria
shoulder.
had a big jug of wine on her shoulder and pouring people glasses of wine after we played.
Yes.
But we played, it was more than one day. We played all.
You played-
We didn't play the movements of the second quartet that had voice.
The voice, yeah.
Because we didn't have a voice with us.
Yes.
But we played everything else, and we didn't play his early quartet. You know, he wrote a quartet that sounds very much like Dvorak.
Yeah.
We played that in the Library of Congress, but we never played it for him. But we played the first, second, third, and fourth quartets for him.
Now tell me, should he write a book?
No
Yes,
question.
yes.
No, but you told us that
Yeah.
you played a quartet, one of his
I
quartets.
think it was
for
the
him.
first quartet, and what you were going to
Yeah,
tell us
when
his
he-
reaction because
No, that's true.
because you said
But
about the composer's
we played it, and
concept.
we played it to the hilt the way we felt
Yes.
it, and we thought we were playing it the way our mentors had told us that Schoenberg liked the piece. And when it was over, he said, "Well, you played it in a way I never conceived of it." And we, of course, were falling through the floor, feeling terrible. And finally, I had enough energy. I don't know if I had guts or anything. I said, "Well, please, Mr. Schoenberg, we couldn't play for Beethoven, but we can play for you. Please tell us what we should do to play it the way you conceived of it." And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "I liked it. You continue to play it this way." And so we did.
That's a wonderful
That's
story.
a wonderful story. Just maybe to conclude, could you tell us how you started the Juilliard Quartet, how the founding of the Juilliard Quartet came about?
Well, I was drafted, and just by circumstance. I mean, I ended up in the Signal Corps in Camp Crowder in Missouri, and I went through basic training there. And then they were starting a band school in the Signal Corps. And so, because they knew I was a musician, they transferred me over to this band school. And I became sort of a cadre in that. And in came, in some of the new recruits, a cellist whom I knew, Arthur Winograd, and a pianist whom I didn't know by the name of Bernard Layton, who was a jazz pianist, basically, but he'd studied with Bruce Simon at Yale and was also a very interestingly cultured pianist. He could play, he gave 2 Carnegie recitals as a classical pianist, and he played with Benny Goodman for 6 months, so he had standards in
He
both.
was a very famous white jazz player. There
Yes.
weren't that many of
Yes,
them.
most of the great jazz pianists were black.
Black.
So anyway, we got together and we played some classical. We played a Brahms trio, and we got to. And finally, he knew somebody on an island in the Long Island Sound that was its main job was watching for U-boats that might come into Long Island Sound for sabotage or destroying the Groton, Connecticut submarine building base. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up there. We played trios. And at that time, my first job had been in the Albuquerque Music Festival, where I met a woman who was a famous amazing woman. She was the daughter of Mark Hanna. She had married Bertie McCormick of the Chicago Tribune. She was an horribly conservative person. I was sort of a Trotskyite, and there I was in Albuquerque, and we liked each other enormously, despite she was at one end of the political spectrum and I was at the other. And she always said, Robert, if this war is over and you're still available, I would like to support a string quartet at the University of New Mexico. So that was my dream. I wanted to have a quartet. Yes. So I'm on Fisher's Island in New England, in the Sound there, Long Island Sound. And she used to write me. She was the Tom Dewey's Western campaign manager against Roosevelt. She would say, do you think the soldiers are going to vote for Tom Dewey? And I didn't know how to answer. But she was very sure that she wanted to have a string quartet. And that's where I thought if I survived, I was going to be. Anyway, our friend Edgar Schenkman, who is conducting at Juilliard, and a friend of William Schumann's, who started, a new way of education at Juilliard. And we used to come in on passes and play chair music at Schenkman's place. And at one point, I said, Oberlin has had a resident string quartet. Other pieces, why can't Juilliard have a resident string quartet? And so Edgar Schenkman said, I happen to know William Schumann has that in mind. So eventually we were writing to him to ask if they would consider it. In the meantime, I was hoping to have this quartet in New Mexico. Yes. But then this woman died on the range. She was riding the range and the horse fell in a gopher hole. She broke her hip, had an infection, and she died. That was the end of my dream, because I would have ended up in New Mexico. Even if the Juilliard quartet were possible, I would have rather been in the mountains. But then,
I would have rather have been in New Mexico.
Yeah, but I didn't know you yet. I didn't know you. So anyway, then I was asked to have an interview with William Schumann. And it was very interesting because we didn't have a quartet then. We just had Robert Koff, who was a violin, me, and Winograd, who was a cellist. We didn't have a violist yet. Oh. And we tried like mad to have one, but we didn't succeed. So it was decided I would go and have the interview without a complete quartet. And so Schumann was interesting. We talked about music. Yes. And I said one thing that he kept quoting for the rest of his life. And that was, he said, what's your goal in the way you play music? And I said, and I thought this up on the spur of the moment, I would like to be a quartet that plays old music as if it has just been composed, and new music if it had been composed a long time ago. And he loved that. And then he said, the next question he asked me was, will you be the greatest quartet in the world? And I laughed. I said, you can't. I can't answer that. I said, but I can guarantee you will be one of the great quartets. And he said, that's enough for me. That's how the Juilliard quartet was for. So he finally said, take your time and get a violist, and that's it. And that's how we started.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story.
That is a wonderful story.
May I just ask real quickly, how did it happen then that you went to the Library of Congress? Whose idea was that?
Well, that was an interesting thing, too, because the Budapest were there for a long time. Yes. It wasn't the Budapest that started it. Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, had given the money to build the hall. Then a very strange woman by the name of Whitall gave the money to buy instruments, and Krasner, who knew her, sort of helped her to buy all the instruments. So they had a hall and 4 more. They had 5 Strats. And basically, they tried for 1 year or 2 to just have an ad hoc quartet that would come together and play the instruments, and it didn't work. Yeah. So then they finally hired, Harold Spivak was the head of the music division, and he hired the greatest quartet in the world at that time, the Budapest, to be that. Now, the reason he began to think otherwise, he told me, so I know this, was that it wasn't that the Budapest was playing less good or anything like that, but the Budapest was not geared to playing contemporary music, and the Library of Congress was commissioning and having new music played all over the place, whether it was Copland or this composer or that. They wanted new music.
And the Budapest was doing it?
No, they weren't happy. They didn't even like, they played a couple of Bartoks and decided they didn't even want to play Bartok, you see. So that was one thing. The second problem was that Alexander Schneider wanted to do other things than play second violin in the Budapest Quartet. So he literally left the quartet to form a piano quartet with Frank Miller and so on. And they had to get other second violinists, and it didn't work. And finally, Alexander Schneider came in for a while, and he was threatening to leave again. And so Harold Spivak finally, we had played a few single concerts at the library for the Kusevitsky Foundation. And finally, one day, I was at home, and he called. And he said, "Are you sitting or standing?" So I said, "Harold, why are you asking? I'm standing." He said, "Well, sit down." So I sat down. He said, "Will the Juilliard Quartet be willing to come as the resident string quartet instead of the Budapest?" And I just was flabbergasted.
Oh, that's
And of
fantastic,
course,
yes.
it was very hurtful to the Budapest Quartet because they really were a great quartet. Here was this upstart Juilliard Quartet taking their
And when
place.
was
Yeah,
that?
what year was that?
Oh, God.
In the 60s?
I don't really remember.
Earlier?
Library of Congress. Yeah.
It was in the maybe the late 60s. I'm not sure.
Oh, the late 60s,
Yeah,
There
we
must
were
be
there.
some
I was there for about 30 years,
yeah.
and then when I left the quartet, they still went there.
Yes.
Matter of fact, I just got a request to make a statement about the library and its support of chamber music.
And they're having some sort of anniversary.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Well,
Well,
this has been
thank you so
fascinating.
much.
Both of
It's,
you.
yes,
Oh,
it's been great.
come on, it's been a nice
It's been
afternoon.
great.